Leo's world began and ended at his window. It was a large old window, with a dried-out frame that his father had winterized as best he could. It didn't look out onto the dusty village street, with its curious glances and the rare sputtering of motorcycles, but onto the backyard, beyond which the woods began immediately, immense, mysterious, and silent. This view was his main painting, his personal movie theater, his endless book. At 14, Leo knew this landscape by heart. He knew which of the pines would first catch the rays of the rising sun on its crown. He knew on which branch of the old birch the magpies loved to sit, discussing their avian news. He knew in which curve of the old mossy fence the neighbor's ginger cat liked to bask in the sun. This world was his, quiet, predictable, safe. His own body was far less predictable and obedient. Cerebral palsy. 3 words, like a sentence, that he had learned to say to himself without tears or pity. It was just a given, like the color of his hair or the shape of his nose. It was just that his body lived by its own, different, more complex laws. His legs didn't always want to obey, turning every step into a small battle requiring utmost concentration. His hands sometimes trembled, and a straight line in a notebook would turn into a crooked, jumping zigzag, and the words that formed into smooth, beautiful phrases in his head sometimes came out with difficulty, stumbling, as if they too were limping. But Leo didn't see it as a tragedy. It was just a feature of his life, like rainy weather or an early winter, something to adapt to. He learned to walk slowly but surely, leaning on his light metal quad cane. He learned to write in large block letters, forming each one with stubborn patience. He learned to be silent when he knew he couldn't express his thoughts quickly and clearly. This silence made him an observer. Since he couldn't easily communicate with the world of people, he learned to communicate with another world, the world of books, paints, and the life that existed beyond his window. His room was his fortress and his universe. Along one wall stretched shelves of books. There were old, well-read fairy tales, thick encyclopedias about animals and plants, and adventure novels whose heroes ran, jumped, and fought with swords with ease. Leo loved them all. Books gave him what he was deprived of, freedom of movement. With them, he could travel the world, dive to the bottom of the ocean, and soar to the stars. On the desk by the window there was always a sketchbook and a box of watercolors. Leo drew. He couldn't draw people. Their faces seemed too complex, too changeable. He drew what he saw from his window. He drew the forest, hundreds of times in different seasons, in different weather. Here it was gloomy, wintry, in a grey cap of snow. Here it was cheerful in the spring, in a delicate light green haze of new leaves. Here it was mysterious, in the summer, bathed in the gold of sunset. He knew all the shades of green, all the sheens of grey on the tree bark. He wasn't just copying the landscape, he was painting its soul. His parents, Irene and Simon, were his main support and his constant worry. They loved him immensely, with that desperate, all-consuming love that only parents of a child with health issues are capable of. Simon, a strong, silent man who worked at the local sawmill, had built convenient handrails for him throughout the house with his own hands, and made a low, wide porch to make it easier for him to go outside. Irene, his wife, a thin woman with perpetually tired but gentle eyes, had dedicated her entire self to her son. She spent hours with him doing therapeutic exercises, giving him massages, and reading to him aloud. But Leo saw how tired they were. He saw how in the evenings his father would sit at the table, his large, strong hands dropped, and stare silently into space. He saw how his mother secretly cried in the kitchen, thinking no one could hear her. He heard their quiet, anxious conversations at night, about money, which was never enough for expensive doctors and rehabilitation, about the future. What would happen to Leo when they were gone? And he saw their fear of the world's cruelty. They tried to shield him, to create a safe cocoon for him. They rarely let him leave the yard alone, afraid of sidelong glances and cruel taunts. They knew how cruel children could be, and they feared for their fragile, vulnerable boy. Their love was both his protection and his cage, and the only place where he felt truly free was his window. He would sit by it for hours, his chin propped on his hand, and watch. He knew all the birds that came to the feeder. He knew the habits of the neighbor's cat. He knew how the color of the sky changed before rain. He was a part of this world, silent and unseen. And one day, at the beginning of winter, when the ground was already covered with a thin layer of the first snow, a new character appeared in his world. It happened in the evening. Leo was doing his homework when he caught a movement at the edge of his vision. He looked up. From the deep twilight, silently, like a shadow, a wolf emerged. It was large, grey, with a thick, glossy coat. It stopped right at the edge of the trees and lifted its head, sniffing the frosty air. It didn't look at the house. It just stood there, confident, calm, the embodiment of wild, primordial power. Leo froze, afraid to move. He had only seen wolves in pictures in his encyclopedias, but this one was real, alive. He wasn't scared. On the contrary, he was seized by a strange, reverent excitement. It was perfect. Every movement, every muscle under its grey hide, everything spoke of freedom, the very freedom he was denied. The wolf stood like that for a minute, then just as silently dissolved into the forest darkness. But Leo knew it would be back, and it returned. The next evening, and the evening after that, it would simply come out to the edge of the woods and stand there, gazing into the distance. This became their secret. Leo told no one about his nightly visitor. Not his mom, not his dad. He was afraid they would be scared, that his father would grab his rifle. This was his secret, his friend. He sat at his window, and the wolf stood at the edge of its forest. 50 yards of empty, snow-covered space separated them. But to Leo, it felt like there was no distance at all. He looked at it, and he was sure it felt his gaze. Two lonely beings, on the border of two worlds, who had found in each other a silent but complete understanding. The window was no longer just glass to him. It had become a portal to another, real, free life. A life where there was no pain or pity, only the quiet, majestic beauty and strength of a wild animal. If home and the forest were a realm of peace and acceptance for Leo, then school was hell, noisy, cruel, and merciless. Every trip there turned into an ordeal, a small war from which he emerged, defeated time and time again. The rural school building was an old 2-story structure. The long, echoing corridors, painted halfway up with institutional green paint, always smelled of something sour, either cabbage soup from the cafeteria or old, wet rags. During breaks, these corridors transformed into a turbulent river of screaming, running, pushing children, and for Leo, this river was full of rapids and whirlpools. The hardest part was the journey from the classroom door to his desk by the window. Those 30 feet under the gaze of his classmates felt longer than the entire path to the forest lake. He would walk, leaning on his quad cane, trying to place his feet evenly, concentrating on each step, but his body wouldn't obey. His legs would get tangled, and he would sway slightly from side to side. And he could hear it. He could always hear the quiet, venomous laughter behind him. The main source of this laughter was Vince, the son of a local farmer, the tallest and strongest boy in the class. He wasn't evil by nature. He was cruel out of boredom. In the small, sleepy village where nothing ever happened, someone else's weakness was his best entertainment. And Leo, with his clumsy gait and slurred speech, was the perfect target. He never touched him physically. He was smarter than that. His weapon was words, humiliating, wounding words, thrown with a smirk for the amusement of his entourage, a couple of other idlers who hung on his every word. "Oh, look, here comes Leo the Gimp," he would say loudly, for the whole class to hear as Leo entered. "Hey, Leo, don't lose your cane, or you'll fall apart completely." The class would laugh, some openly, others covering their mouths with their hands. Leo pretended not to hear. He would lower his head, his light hair falling over his face, hiding his treacherously trembling lips and the tears welling up. He would make it to his desk, sit down, and bury his face in a textbook, trying to make himself as small and inconspicuous as possible. Lessons were his salvation. When the teacher started talking, the class would quiet down, and Leo could immerse himself in the world of formulas, dates, and rules for 40 minutes. He was a diligent student. What he couldn't achieve physically, he compensated for with intelligence and hard work. He read a lot, and his written assignments were always the best in the class. But as soon as the bell rang, hell returned. He especially dreaded being called to the blackboard. The literature teacher, Mrs. Davis, an older woman with kind but tired eyes, sometimes called on him. She did it with the best intentions, trying to socialize the quiet boy. "Leo, come to the board and tell us about Romeo's love for Juliet." And Leo would go, across the whole classroom under the snickers and whispers. He would stand at the board. He knew everything. He could have talked for hours about Romeo's feelings, his passion, the tragedy of his love. But the words would get stuck in his throat. He would open his mouth, and the sounds would come out slowly, with difficulty, distorted. Romeo, as very passionate. And at that moment, from the back of the room, Vince's mocking voice, parodying his speech, would ring out, "Ro-o-o, me-o-o-o." The class would erupt in laughter, loud, merciless laughter. Mrs. Davis would rap her pointer on the desk. "Quiet! Vince! Stop that!" But it didn't help. The laughter was unstoppable. Leo would stand at the board, red as a beet, and feel the tears burning his eyes. He would stumble, forget his words, and finally, unable to bear the humiliation any longer, fall silent. "Sit down, Leo, sit down," Mrs. Davis would sigh, giving him a B out of pity. And Leo would walk back to his seat, feeling dozens of eyes on his back. Some looked with contempt, others with pity, and he didn't know which was worse. The teachers pretended nothing serious was happening. They were busy with work, paperwork, their own problems. To them, it was just kids being kids. They would reprimand Vince, sometimes even threaten to call his parents. But his father was an important man in the village, a sponsor of the school. No one wanted to argue with him. And so everything stayed the same. The other children, they weren't evil. Many of them, deep down, sympathized with Leo. But the fear of Vince, the fear of becoming the target of ridicule themselves, was stronger. They remained silent. They looked away. They betrayed him with their silence every day. And Leo remained silent too. He told no one about his pain, not his parents, so as not to upset them even more, not the teachers, because he didn't believe they could change anything. He carried his pain within him. And this pain, like a slow poison, was killing him from the inside. He learned to build an invisible wall around himself, a wall of silence, of downcast eyes, of being lost in his own thoughts. This wall protected him, but it also separated him from the world. There was only one place where this wall crumbled, at his window. When he returned from school, the first thing he did was run to his room. He would sit on the windowsill and look at the forest. The forest didn't laugh at him. The trees didn't whisper behind his back. The birds didn't mimic his speech. The forest accepted him as he was. And with the arrival of winter, he gained another friend. A silent, mysterious one. When Shadow appeared at the edge of the woods in the evening, Leo forgot all his grievances. He would look at him, and his heart would fill with a quiet, bright joy. He was strong, he was free, he was alone just like him, but his loneliness was not from weakness, but from strength. He talked to him, told him about Vince, about his tears, about his humiliation, and it seemed to him that he understood, that he was watching him from his forest darkness with his intelligent amber eyes and sympathizing with him. This secret friendship became his salvation, his anchor in the stormy sea of school cruelty. It gave him the strength to live day by day, to walk through the echoing, hostile corridors, to endure the taunts, to be silent, and to wait for the evening, to wait for the grey shadow to appear outside his window, when he would feel again that he was not alone in this world. He did not yet know that his silent forest friend, unlike people, would not leave him in trouble, and that his justice would be swift, silent, and very terrifying for his tormentors. Winter arrived early that year in November, and immediately set to work with all its northern thoroughness. It blanketed the village in deep, waist-high snow, bound the river with thick, ringing ice, and painted the windows with frosty, fanciful patterns resembling fairy-tale ferns. For most of the villagers it was a time of quiet, a long, sleepy wait for spring, when life freezes within four walls and the days are all alike. But for Leo, winter became a time of magic. His world outside the window was transformed. It resembled a black and white engraving, stern and majestic, the black graphic trunks of pines against a dazzlingly white background, a grey, low, cottony sky, and silence. That special winter silence, when every sound, the crunch of snow under someone's boots, a distant dog's bark, the crack of a frozen tree, seems distinct, important, and a little unsettling. Leo loved this time. He could sit for hours by the window, watching the rare large snowflakes fall, swirling in an invisible dance. He watched the tits and bullfinches like bright Christmas ornaments flock to the feeder his father had made for him. He knew all his feathered guests by sight, knew their habits and characters. This puffed-up sparrow was a bully, always trying to push others away from the food. And this tit with a bright yellow breast was a shy one, patiently waiting until everyone had eaten before flying in for its sunflower seed. One evening, on New Year's Eve, as the blue, frosty twilight thickened and the first lights flickered on in the houses, something happened that forever changed his quiet, orderly world. He was sitting by the window, finishing a drawing of a bullfinch in his sketchbook. Outside, it was quiet and deserted. Suddenly, out of the corner of his eye, he caught a movement at the edge of the forest where their garden ended. From the dense, snow-covered firs, a shadow emerged. At first, Leo thought it was a stray dog. Sometimes dogs from the next village would wander over in search of food, attracted by the smells of human habitation. But this creature moved differently. Not restlessly, not dog-like, with a furtive glance. It moved smoothly, confidently, with a lazy, predatory grace that betrayed it as a master, not a beggar. It stepped out into the open, moonlit space, stopped, and lifted its head, sniffing the frosty air that smelled of smoke from the chimneys. It was a wolf. Leo froze, his pencil poised over the paper. His heart skipped a beat, then began to race, not from fear but from a strange, breathtaking excitement. It was incredibly, almost surreally beautiful, huge grey, with a thick, fluffy winter coat that seemed cast from silver in the light of the early moon. Its powerful paws sank deep into the loose snow, making almost no sound. Its intelligent, wedge-shaped head was held proudly on a strong, muscular neck. It stood like a statue, like the spirit of this winter forest, the embodiment of wild, primordial power and absolute freedom. It was alone, and there was nothing pitiful or lost in its solitude. On the contrary, it seemed a sign of strength, confidence, self-sufficiency. It was a king in its icy, silent kingdom. The wolf, apparently, was drawn by the smell of food. His mother, Irene, as was her habit, had put a large pot with leftover evening porridge and rich soup bones on the porch for their old hound, Buster, who lived in a doghouse by the shed. But today Buster, drowsy from the warmth of the stove, was probably already asleep in the entryway, and the smell of food spread freely through the frosty air, reaching the wolf's sensitive nose. Leo wasn't scared, not for a second. He sat by the window, separated from this mighty beast only by a thin layer of glass painted with frosty patterns, and couldn't take his eyes off it. He, who was afraid of his classmates' ridicule, who flinched at loud shouts in the school hallway, now looked at one of the forest's most dangerous predators with complete calm and almost reverent admiration. He felt an inexplicable deep kinship with it. It was alone, and he, in his room, in his world, was also alone. It was a stranger in the world of men, and he was a stranger among his peers. It was strong and free, and he was weak and trapped in his disobedient body. But at that moment, looking at it, he too felt strong and free. The wolf stood like that for a minute, carefully surveying the yard, the house, the lit window. It, of course, saw him, the small human figure behind the glass. But it showed neither fear nor aggression. Its gaze was calm, assessing. Then, slowly, unhurriedly, it crossed the snow-covered garden. It approached the porch, but didn't touch the food in the pot. It only sniffed it, then lifted its head and looked directly at Leo's window. Their eyes met. In its amber, slightly slanted eyes, the boy saw no malice or bloodthirstiness like in the fairy tales. He saw intelligence, caution, and a wisdom as ancient as the forest itself. It seemed to him that it was looking not at him, but through him, directly into his soul. This battle of gazes lasted a few seconds, but for Leo it stretched into an eternity. Time stood still. There was only him, the wolf, and the quiet, snowy night. And then the wolf, as if having made a decision, turned as silently as it had come and left. It didn't run. It walked away with the same regal dignity with which it had appeared. Its grey shadow slipped between the trees and dissolved into the night's darkness. Leo sat by the window for a long time, his forehead pressed against the cold glass. His heart was still pounding. He was stunned. This was his personal great discovery, a secret he couldn't entrust to anyone. He knew it would return. He felt it, and it returned. The next evening, and the evening after that, it would come out to the edge of the woods and just stand there, looking at his window. Sometimes it would sit in the snow like a large dog and seem to doze. But Leo knew it wasn't sleeping. It was listening. It was watching. He gave it a name, Shadow, because it always appeared from the evening gloom, indistinct, ghostly, and disappeared just as mysteriously. This became their ritual, their silent dialogue. He waited for it every evening, and it came. It became his friend, the most loyal, the most understanding. It didn't see his disability, didn't hear his faltering speech. It saw his soul, and he saw in it not just a beast. He saw in it a kindred spirit, another lonely guardian on the border of its world. This secret friendship filled his life with new meaning. The insults at school now seemed petty and insignificant. Vince's taunts no longer hurt so badly, because he knew that in the evening, when everyone went home, the one who was stronger, wiser, and nobler than all his tormentors combined would come to him. His personal, mysterious guardian from the winter forest would come. Shadow's first visit was no accident. Leo knew it, felt it in every fiber of his being. The next evening, he waited for it with a racing heart. He sat by the window from sunset, his eyes fixed on the darkening wall of the forest. And it came. It slipped out of the twilight again, just as silent and majestic. It stood for a moment, looked at his window, and disappeared. This happened again on the third evening, and the fourth. It came as if on schedule, and this became their silent agreement. But this wasn't enough for Leo. He didn't just want to see it. He wanted to do something for it, to somehow thank it for the sense of security and peace it gave him with its mere presence. And he decided to feed it. This was his great secret. He knew his parents would never approve. His father, though not a hunter, considered wolves dangerous predators. And his mother would have died of fear for him, so he had to act in the strictest secrecy. It all started with a piece of bread. In the evening, after dinner, he secretly hid the heel of a loaf of dark, still warm bread. Waiting for his parents to get busy with their own things, he slipped out onto the porch, wearing an old father's jacket over his house clothes. The frosty air bit his cheeks. The yard was bathed in cold moonlight, and the snow under his feet crunched loudly and anxiously. Leo, leaning on his cane, slowly, trying not to make a sound, went to the place where their garden ended. There, at the very edge of the forest, stood an old, wide stump, left from a birch tree felled many years ago. This was their designated meeting place. He placed the piece of bread on the snow-dusted surface of the stump and just as quietly returned to the house. He climbed onto his windowsill and froze, staring into the darkness. An hour passed, then another. Shadow didn't appear. Leo began to think he had scared it away, that the human scent would frighten it off for good. But then he saw it. It came out of the forest, but not into the open as before. It stayed in the shadow of the trees. It stood for a long time without moving, sniffing the air. It smelled both the bread and his human scent. It was cautious. Leo sat without moving, afraid even to breathe. Finally, the wolf, slowly, on bent legs, emerged from the shadows. It approached the stump, quickly snatched the bread, and immediately jumped back into the saving darkness of the forest. Leo exhaled. His heart was pounding with happiness. It had accepted his gift. The next evening he left it another treat. This time it was a piece of boiled meat that he had secretly taken from the soup. And everything happened again. He waited. It came, took the food, and disappeared. And so it became a habit. Every evening at the same time, Leo would bring his modest offering to the old stump. Then he would climb onto the windowsill and wait for his mysterious friend. This became the main event of his day. For these few minutes, he was willing to endure the ridicule at school, his pain, his loneliness. Over time, Shadow grew bolder. It stopped hiding in the shadows. It would come out to the edge of the woods, approach the stump, and before taking the food, it would lift its head and look at his window. This was its way of saying, "Thank you." Their silent dialogue continued. Leo talked to it. Not out loud, of course. Mentally, he told it everything that had accumulated during the day. "You know, Shadow, Vince laughed at me again today. He said I walked like a broken robot, and I was so hurt. But then I remembered you. How strong and beautiful you are, and I didn't care what he said anymore. And today in art class we drew winter. Everyone's winter was sad and grey, but I drew you, against a background of white snow. The teacher said my drawing was the most alive. He shared his small joys and great sorrows with it, and it seemed to him that it was listening, that its calm, wise gaze penetrated the glass, the distance, and touched his very soul. One day, an incident occurred that further strengthened their strange friendship. A strong blizzard raged through the night. The wind howled in the chimney, throwing handfuls of stinging snow against the windows. Leo lay in his bed, unable to sleep. He was thinking about Shadow. Where was it now? Had it found shelter? Was it cold? He couldn't stand it. He got up and went to the window. Nothing was visible beyond the wall of white swirling snow. But he watched, peering into the raging gloom. And suddenly, he saw it. It was there, in its place, at the edge of the woods. It wasn't sitting. It was lying, curled up in a ball, right on the snow, its back to the furious wind. It hadn't left. It had come, despite the storm. It was fulfilling its duty, its ritual. It had come because it knew he would be watching and waiting. Leo pressed his forehead against the cold glass, and tears rolled down his cheeks, tears of tenderness and gratitude. At that moment he understood that this wasn't just his game, his fantasy. It really was his friend, the only one who would never betray or abandon him. Gradually, Shadow grew so accustomed to him that it stopped leaving immediately after taking the food. It would eat its dinner right by the stump and then sit in the snow and just look at his lit window. Sometimes it would sit like that for an hour or more. They were just together, each in their own world, but their worlds touched at that point on the border of the forest and human habitation. Leo drew it, Again and again, his sketchbook was full of its images. Here it stood, its head held high. Here it sat, a snowflake on its muzzle. Here it looked at the moon, its silhouette seeming to be cut from black velvet. He learned to convey not only its appearance but also its character, strength, dignity, loneliness. This secret was his treasure. It warmed him on cold winter evenings. It gave him the strength to endure the hell of school. It filled his life with meaning. He was no longer just Leo the Gimp, an object of ridicule. He was a friend of a wolf, the keeper of its secret, and that made him stronger than all his tormentors. He did not yet know that very soon his mysterious friend would have to step out of the shadows to protect him not only from emotional but also from very real physical threat. But their bond was already so strong that it could withstand any trial. Spring came to Shadow Creek in a rush, as if trying to make up for the long, harsh winter. In a single day, the snow, which had lain in a dense grey blanket just yesterday, suddenly turned black, shrank and cheerful. Babbling streams ran through the village. The air, recently frosty and biting, became soft, moist, filled with the smells of thawed earth, damp leaves and swelling buds. The forest, which had stood stern and silent all winter, began to buzz, come alive, filled with birdsong and activity. For Leo, this spring was special. He felt that he too was awakening along with nature. The winter spent in silent communication with Shadow had changed him. A new, quiet confidence had appeared in him. The fear of the outside world hadn't disappeared, but it was no longer all-consuming. It had taken a back seat to a new, previously unknown feeling, curiosity. He desperately wanted to go beyond his yard, to cross that invisible line where his friend stopped every evening. He wanted to see its world, not from the window, but with his own eyes. To walk the paths it walked, to breathe the same air, to hear the same sounds. This thought, at first timid like the first snowdrop, grew stronger and grew with each passing day, turning into an irresistible desire. One Saturday, when the sun generously bathed the earth in its warmth and the first hesitant greenery had already appeared in the thawed patches, Leo made a decision. "Mom, I'm going for a walk in the woods," he said, as they were having breakfast. Irene, his mother, who was just pouring tea, froze with the teapot in her hand. "Where, honey? The woods, alone?" "Yes," Leo answered firmly. "On the path, not far." "Leo, but that's dangerous." His mother's voice held the familiar, ingrained anxiety. "You know, there are wild animals, and the ground is still wet and uneven. You could fall, twist your ankle. Who would help you?" "I'll be careful," Leo replied just as calmly. "I have my cane, and I really want to go, please." Simon, his father, who had been silently reading the newspaper until then, looked up at him. He saw in his son's face not a whim, but a new, unfamiliar determination. He saw how he had changed over the winter, how he had matured. There was no longer that haunted look in his eyes. "Let him go, Irene," he said, surprising himself. "He's not going deep into the woods. He'll walk along the edge for an hour and come back. We can't keep him locked up his whole life." Irene looked at her husband, then at her son. She sighed but didn't argue. She knew her husband was right, but a mother's heart still clenched with fear. "All right," she relented, "but I beg you, be very careful, and don't go far, and be home in an hour." Leo beamed. He quickly got dressed, pulled on his old but comfortable jeans, rubber boots to keep his feet dry, and a light jacket. He took his trusty quad cane. "I'll be back soon," he shouted from the doorway and stepped out onto the porch. His heart was pounding with excitement. This wasn't just a walk, it was an escape from his own cage, built of fear and others' cruelty. He slowly walked across the yard, out the gate, and stopped. Before him was the path leading into the depths of the forest, the very one he had looked at so many times from his window. Now it seemed to him a road to another unexplored world. He took the first step, then a second. Leaning on his cane, he moved forward slowly but surely. The world around him was deafeningly alive. The moss under his feet was soft and springy, and it smelled of dampness and young pine needles. The sun's rays, breaking through the still bare branches of the trees, created a whimsical, lacy play of light and shadow on the ground. Somewhere high in the sky, a lark was singing, a woodpecker was drumming, a mouse rustled in last year's leaves. Leo walked and absorbed these sounds, these smells. He felt like an explorer. Every step was difficult. He had to watch his feet carefully to avoid tripping on a root or getting stuck in the mud. But this physical difficulty was nothing compared to the feeling of freedom that overwhelmed him. He walked and thought about Shadow. This is the path it walks. These are the trees it sees every day. This is the air it breathes. He tried to imagine the world through its eyes, to feel what it felt. He was already quite far from the house, about 300 yards. The path here curved, skirting a small ravine overgrown with willows. Leo decided to rest a bit. He found a dry stump, the very one where he had brought treats for his friend, and sat down. Silence. Peace. He was alone, but he didn't feel lonely. It seemed to him that the whole forest was watching him, friendly, with curiosity. He closed his eyes and turned his face to the warm spring sun. For the first time in years, he felt happy. Just like that, for no reason. Happy because he was here, because he was alive, because he had overcome his fear. He didn't know that he was being watched too. But these were not the friendly eyes of the forest. They were cold, angry eyes that saw in him not a vulnerable boy, but just a target for their boredom and cruelty. He did not yet know that his short walk to freedom was about to turn into the worst nightmare of his life. But at that moment, he was just happy. He sat on a stump in the middle of the awakening spring forest, and this forest was his temple, and he was its small but very brave parishioner. The feeling of euphoria, as fragile and weightless as a butterfly's wing, was short-lived. The first alarm was a distant but distinct laugh. Loud and brash, it sounded like a dissonant note in the quiet harmony of the spring forest, like a wrong note in a well-tuned melody. Leo flinched and opened his eyes. His sense of peace vanished instantly, replaced by a familiar, chillingly sticky fear. He recognized that laugh. Only one person in his world laughed like that. Vince. He hastily got up from the stump and grabbed his cane. He had to leave right now. Go back home, to his safe fortress. He almost ran, as much as his disobedient legs would allow, stumbling over roots, getting stuck in the damp earth. But it was too late. From around the bend in the path, from behind the dense hazel thickets, they appeared. Vince and his constant entourage, 2 boys from his class, Serge and Cole. They weren't inherently evil, but they were weak, spineless, and their eyes always reflected the same cruel smirk as their leaders. They were walking, lazily breaking branches, kicking last year's leaves. They were loitering in the forest out of the same boredom and ennui that consumed them within the school walls, looking for entertainment. And they had found it. "Well, well, who do we have here?" Vince drawled, noticing Leo. His face spread into a wide, predatory grin. "Look, guys, it's Leo the Gimp, all by himself without his mommy, crawled into the woods. Miracles will never cease." Serge and Cole immediately picked up his tone, guffawing like hyenas. "What are you doing here, Leo?" Serge asked, coming closer. "Looking for mushrooms? With those legs of yours, you'll only be picking toadstools." Leo was silent. He lowered his head, trying to slip past them. His heart was pounding so hard it felt like it would jump out of his chest. He tried not to look at them, not to listen to them. He just wanted to leave. But they weren't going to let him go. This was too much fun. To see their usual victim here in the forest, alone, defenseless, it was a real stroke of luck, a gift from fate. Vince stepped forward and blocked the path with his broad chest. "Where are we in such a hurry, huh?" he asked, and his voice went from mocking to insinuatingly threatening. "Don't you want to chat? We missed you. At school, you're always so quiet." "Let me pass," Leo whispered, almost inaudibly. "What's that?" he drawled mockingly, cupping his hand to his ear. "I can't hear you. Speak up, or we healthy folks won't understand your mumbling." He took another step, invading his personal space. Leo backed away, and his foot, landing in a hole, twisted. He lost his balance but managed to catch himself on his cane at the last moment. "The cane! That was it! Oh, what's this fancy stick you've got?" Cole, the most cowardly of the three, decided to show off too. He darted towards Leo and with a sharp movement yanked the cane out of his hands. "Let me have a look!" Deprived of his support, Leo couldn't stay upright. He flailed his arms and fell with a dull thud onto the damp, cold ground. The pain from the fall was nothing compared to the suffocating, all-consuming feeling of humiliation that washed over him. He lay on the ground, in the mud, and they stood over him. 3 big, strong, healthy boys, and they were laughing. Their laughter was more terrifying than any roar of a wild beast. It was devoid of any meaning except one: the desire to inflict pain, to revel in someone else's helplessness. "Oops, he fell!" Vince exclaimed theatrically. "So clumsy! Well, get up. What are you lying around for?" Leo tried to get up, pushing himself up with his hands, but without his cane on the uneven ground, he couldn't do it. He tried again and again, but his body wouldn't obey, and he fell back helplessly. Leo's fall was the point of no return for Vince. Until that moment, it had been just a mean, familiar game, a way to boost his ego at someone else's expense. But now, seeing him, lying on the damp ground, helpless, humiliated, he felt the intoxicating taste of real, absolute power, the power of the strong over the weak. And he liked that taste. The laughter of his cronies, Serge and Cole, added fuel to the fire. They were laughing not only at Leo, but also for him, their leader. It was their tribute, their acknowledgement of his leadership. And Vince, reveling in the moment, decided to raise the stakes. "Oops, he fell!" he exclaimed theatrically, pretending to be sympathetic. "So clumsy! Well, get up. What are you lying around for, or do you need help?" Leo, swallowing tears of humiliation, tried to get up. He pressed his palms into the wet, cold earth, tried to shift his weight, to pull his disobedient legs under him. But without his cane, without his usual support, his body became a traitor. His muscles wouldn't obey, his legs gave way. He made one desperate effort and collapsed helplessly into the mud again. Their laughter grew even louder. It sounded like the cackling of hyenas that had found a wounded gazelle. "He can't even get up!" Serge shouted, choking with laughter. "Look, guys, how he's floundering!" Leo stopped trying. He curled into a ball, covering his face with his hands. It was his only defense, to hide, to disappear, to cease to exist for them. He retreated into his inner saving darkness, hoping they would soon get bored and leave. But he was wrong. His helplessness only excited them more. "Hey, what are you doing, crying?" Vince came over and gave him a light kick in the side with the toe of his boot. It wasn't a hard kick, more a gesture of contempt, a way to test the boundaries. "Don't cry, Leo, we're just kidding." But there wasn't a shadow of remorse in his voice. A nasty, feverish glint burned in his eyes. Boredom demanded more. Just laughing at him was no longer interesting. He wanted real, sharp entertainment. He wanted fear, his fear. "Let's play a game," he suddenly suggested, and his voice became quiet, insinuating, which made it sound even more sinister. "Let's be real forest bandits, and he'll be our prisoner." Serge and Cole exchanged glances. A shadow of doubt flickered in their eyes. This was ceasing to be just a mean joke. "Vince, what are you—" Cole began uncertainly. "Maybe we shouldn't. Let's just go." "Shut up!" Vince snapped at him. His face instantly twisted with anger. He couldn't stand his authority being questioned. "I said we'll play, so we'll play. Or maybe you want to sit next to him. Scared, are you?" The word scared was more terrifying to them as teenagers than any accusation. Cole immediately wilted, lowering his eyes. "No, I just—" I was just saying—" "Then shut up just saying," Vince cut him off. He turned back to Leo. "Here's the idea. We'll drag him over to that old pine tree, tie him to it, and leave him. Let him sit here for an hour or two, think about his behavior, scream a little, call the wolves. How romantic!" The suggestion made Leo's blood run cold. He sharply raised his head. His tear-streaked eyes were filled with genuine terror. It was one thing to endure taunts. It was quite another to be left alone, in the forest, tied to a tree. This was no longer bullying. This was cruelty in its pure, concentrated form. "Don't, please," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I'll go home. I won't tell anyone." "Oh, he's talking," Vince rejoiced, like a magician who had successfully performed a difficult trick. "This is even more interesting. So he's not mute. Well, guys, let's get to it." He took a decisive step towards Leo. Serge and Cole, overcoming their last doubts, followed him. They were followers, slaves to his will. They feared him more than their own consciences. The situation became critical. Leo understood this with terrifying clarity. He was alone, in a dense forest, against 3 boys who were caught up in the excitement and no longer understood where the game ended and the crime began. No one would hear him. No one would come to help. His parents thought he was walking along the edge of the woods. They wouldn't start looking for him for at least an hour. Anything could happen in that time. Panic, an animalistic fear seized him. He tried to crawl away, but Vince was faster. He bent down and grabbed him by the collar of his jacket. His fingers were strong and hard. "Gotcha, little bird," he hissed in his ear. He began to drag him across the ground towards the pine tree. Branches scratched his face, and mud got into his hair. He struggled, but his weak attempts were laughable compared to Vince's strength. Serge and Cole walked alongside, laughing, already anticipating the fun. Leo squeezed his eyes shut. The whole world narrowed to the feeling of a hard hand on his neck and the smell of damp earth. He was no longer crying. The tears had dried up. All that remained inside was a cold, ringing terror. And at that very moment, when all hope was dead, when he had prepared himself for the worst, a sound came from the dense hazel thickets that grew on the slope of the ravine. It wasn't the snap of a twig, not a bird's cry, not even a dog's bark. The sound was low, guttural, vibrating. It was born somewhere deep in a mighty chest, and was filled with such restrained, icy fury that it seemed the very air trembled. It was the sound a landslide makes before it starts, the sound a high-voltage wire makes before it snaps. Vince froze. His hand, gripping Leo's jacket, slackened for a moment. "What the hell was that?" he asked nervously, looking around. "A bear, maybe," Cole suggested fearfully, taking a step back. "What bear? They're still hibernating." Vince tried to maintain his composure, though his voice was no longer so confident. "Probably some stray. Hey, who's there? Get lost, mutt." In response, silence. Then the growl came again, this time louder, lower, and with distinctly menacing rolling notes. It was a final warning, a warning that left no doubt. Whoever made it was not joking. And it emerged. It didn't jump out, didn't leap. It stepped onto the path from the thicket, silently, smoothly, like a ghost woven from grey mist and twilight. It was Shadow, but it wasn't the same Shadow that Leo saw from his window. There, at a distance, it had seemed just a beautiful, strong animal. Here, 10 feet away, it was the embodiment of primal terror. It was huge, far larger than they could have imagined. Its powerful, muscular paws stood firmly on the ground. The thick grey fur on its hackles stood on end, like the mane of a prehistoric monster, making its silhouette even more massive and frightening. And from its bare jaws, from which thick saliva dripped to the ground, protruded long yellow fangs, sharp as daggers. But the most terrifying thing was its eyes. Amber. They did not burn with a mad, uncontrolled rage. They were cold, as icy as a winter river, and they were not looking at all 3 of them. They were fixed on one point, on Vince's face. There was no hatred in that gaze. There was something worse, the complete, absolute, contemptuous indifference of a predator to its prey. The look one gives to something that is about to cease to exist. The look of a judge delivering a death sentence. The teenagers were petrified. They had grown up in the village, seen wolves in pictures, heard drunken hunting stories about them. But they had never come face to face with this, with reality. And the reality was that 3 steps separated them from this beast, from its fangs. 3 steps that it could cover in a fraction of a second. It's a wolf, Cole stammered, his teeth chattering so loudly it was audible in the ensuing silence. "Let's get out of here!" Serge shrieked, the first to recover from the shock. Forgetting himself in fear, he turned and bolted back down the path, stumbling, falling, and getting up again. Cole, without thinking, followed him. Vince was left alone, face to face with the wolf. His face had lost all color, turning a pasty white. The hand that had held Leo released its grip. He slowly, very slowly, began to back away, never taking his eyes off the beast. "Nice, nice doggy," he stammered, and his voice, usually loud and arrogant, was now pathetic and thin. I didn't do anything. I was just—" Shadow didn't even move. It just stood there, watching, waiting. It was giving him a chance to leave, to crawl away, to save his worthless life. And then Vince made his last fatal mistake. In a panic, trying to defend himself somehow, or perhaps just out of impotent rage, he bent down to pick up a heavy stick from the ground. The very moment his fingers touched the wood, the wolf let out another growl, short, sharp, like the crack of a whip, and it took a step forward. That was enough. Animal terror, the primal instinct for self-preservation, which was stronger than any coolness, broke everything in Vince. He forgot about his reputation, about his friends, about everything in the world. He screamed, a high, shrill, girlish scream, and he ran. He ran without looking where he was going, crashing through bushes, scratching his face and hands on thorny branches. He ran from his fear, from his shame, from those icy amber eyes that he felt were burning into his back. The wolf watched him go. It didn't pursue him. It didn't need to. Its goal was achieved. The threat was eliminated. Its master, its small, defenseless friend, was safe. Silence reigned on the path. So thick and deep it seemed you could hear the frightened dust settling on the ground. The bully's screams faded in the distance. Only 2 remained. The boy, lying on the damp, cold ground, and the huge grey wolf, standing over him like a statue. Leo slowly raised his head. He looked at Shadow, and the fear was gone. There was only shock and a boundless, all-consuming sense of gratitude that took his breath away. It came. It had heard his silent cry for help, and it had come. His mysterious friend, his forest ghost, was real, and it had saved him. Shadow stopped growling. Its body relaxed. The fur on its hackles settled down. It took a step towards him. Leo instinctively pressed himself into the ground, but it wasn't going to attack. It came over and gently, almost delicately, nudged his cheek with its cold, wet nose. It was a touch full of tenderness and concern. It sniffed him, checking if he was okay, if he was hurt. And then it did something that completely melted his heart. It looked at the cane lying in the distance, his faithful support that Cole had snatched away. It walked over to it, carefully took it in its jaws and, trying not to scratch it with its fangs, brought it and placed it next to Leo. This was not just a gesture. It was an act of incredible, almost human understanding. It didn't just chase away his tormentors. It returned to him the one thing without which he was helpless. It was giving him back the ability to stand on his own feet, both literally and figuratively. Tears welled up in his eyes again, but now they were not tears of hurt and humiliation. They were tears of gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you, Shadow." Leaning on his cane, he managed to get up, though with difficulty. His legs were shaking, his clothes were covered in mud, but he was standing on his own 2 feet. The wolf stood beside him, not moving an inch. It didn't rush him. It waited. When he felt more steady, it gently nudged him with its nose towards the house. It was time to go. They walked back together. Leo, slowly, leaning on his cane, and Shadow walking beside him, slightly ahead, like a loyal bodyguard escorting his charge. It didn't go back into the forest. It walked him all the way home, to the very edge of its world. At the fence of their garden, it stopped. It looked at him one last time, as if to make sure he was completely safe, and then, silently, as always, it turned and disappeared into the evening twilight. Leo reached the porch and collapsed onto the steps, exhausted. He was alone, but he would never feel lonely again. Vince and his cronies ran back to the village, pale, scratched, and scared to death. They, of course, didn't tell the truth. They made up a story about being attacked in the woods by a rabid, man-eating wolf, huge, like a calf. They lied to justify their shameful retreat and to turn the adults against the wolf. And they almost succeeded. Panic gripped the village. The men grabbed their rifles, preparing to organize a hunt. Leo's father, Simon, also took his rifle. He was ready to protect his son and his family. At that moment, Leo returned home. Dirty, tear-stained, but with burning eyes. "Don't!" he shouted, and his voice sounded surprisingly loud and firm. "Don't touch it!" And he told them. He told them everything about Vince and his bullying, about how they had knocked him to the ground and wanted to tie him to a tree, and about how Shadow had come and saved him. He spoke haltingly, stammering, but his words were filled with such sincerity and pain that everyone fell silent. Simon listened to his son, his face turning to stone. He looked at his dirty clothes, the scratches on his face, and his fists clenched. Irene hugged her son, crying with grief and pride for his courage. When Leo finished, a heavy silence fell in the room. The first to break it was Vince's father, the farmer, who had also rushed over at the commotion. "He's lying," he roared. "My son would never. She's the one who's been feeding the wolf, the little witch." "Shut up," Simon said quietly, but in a way that sent a chill down the farmer's spine. He lowered his rifle. "We're going into the woods now, all of us, and we'll look at the tracks. And if, besides the wolf tracks, we find the tracks of your son's boots, then you and I will have a different conversation." And they went. Simon, Vince's father, the local sheriff who had been called, and a few other men. Leo, despite his exhaustion, went with them to show the way. At the scene, the evidence was more eloquent than any words. Trampled grass, signs of a struggle, the stick Vince had dropped, and the clear prints of 3 pairs of teenage boots and 1 set of wolf paws. The picture was clear. Vince's father turned pale and deflated. He had nothing more to say. The punishment for the bullies was harsh but fair. Not legal but social. Their actions became public knowledge throughout the village. Even his loyal lackeys, Serge and Cole, who had confessed everything in their fear, turned away from Vince. At school, no one would talk to him. He became a true outcast, experiencing for the first time what he had so long inflicted on others. They say his father whipped him so badly he couldn't sit for a week. It was a cruel lesson, but perhaps the only one he could understand. Leo's life changed. After he found the strength to tell the truth, the wall he had built around himself crumbled. The classmates who had previously bullied him or silently betrayed him now looked at him with respect and even admiration. They saw not Leo the Gimp, but a brave boy who had an incredible friend. They started approaching him during breaks, offering help, striking up conversations. And Leo, at first cautiously, then more boldly, began to respond. His speech was still not perfect, but they stopped teasing him. They started listening to him. He still sat at his window, but now it was not his only refuge. It was a meeting place with a friend. Shadow continued to come. Every evening, it would emerge at the edge of the woods, and they would look at each other. But something had changed. Their silent dialogue no longer held only pain and loneliness. Now it held respect, a shared secret, and victory. One evening, his father sat next to him on the windowsill. "He's back again," he said quietly, looking at the grey figure at the edge of the woods. "Yes," Leo replied just as quietly. "He always comes." "Thank him," Simon said. "For you, I was wrong. I was afraid of the forest, but it turns out we should be afraid of people." He put his arm around his son's shoulders, and for the first time, Leo felt that his father not only loved him, but also understood him. Understood his connection with this wild, beautiful world. Years passed. Leo grew up. He never learned to run like his peers, but his walk became more confident and his speech clearer. He finished school, moved to the city, and went to university to become a veterinarian. He wanted to help those who couldn't stand up for themselves. But every summer, he returned home to his village, and every evening he would sit at his old window, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes, a familiar grey shadow would emerge from the evening twilight. It had grown old too, with grey on its muzzle. But it remembered. It came to see its brave little boy. His world no longer began and ended at the window. It had become vast, full of people, events and knowledge, but that window would forever remain the most important place on earth for him, the place where he had once found his most loyal, most silent and most true friend, the place where a wolf had protected him from people and taught him not to be afraid of them.